They called him useless, damaged beyond repair, a dog fit only for the end. But when a veteran locked eyes with him across the auction floor, everything changed. Together they would face storms, nightmares, and enemies in the shadows and rise as guardians once again. This is not just a story about a dog. It's about loyalty that refuses to die. Like, subscribe, and join us as the truth unfolds. The shelter sat on the edge of town where the cornfields broke against a chain-link horizon, a low cinder-block building washed in winter light and the sting of disinfectant. Jack Carter parked beneath a sagging maple and killed the engine, letting the quiet gather in the cab with him for a moment longer than necessary. His hands rested on the steering wheel knuckles, pale, as if sound itself might break something fragile he had carefully set down inside. He had not planned to be here. He'd driven in for feed and fencing staples, the kinds of errands that kept a life moving even when sleep did not. And then a notice in the hardware store window had snagged him: County Shelter Open House, Adult Dogs Waived Fees. A volunteer had taped a paper heart to the corner of the poster, red against the dusty glass. He thought of leaving. Then he didn't. Inside, fluorescent fixtures hummed with the patience of machines. A woman in a navy polo smiled with her whole face and slid a clipboard toward him. "Take your time, Mr. Carter," she said when she caught his name from the sign-in. Some of the big ones came in rough. She didn't say what rough meant. The air said enough. Down the corridor, kennels breathed in a metronome of need, paws scuffing tails, thudding the soft, hopeful whine that rose when footsteps approached and went thin when they passed by. Children clutched their parents' sleeves and pointed at puppies in a front room decorated with colorful paw prints. Jack moved the other way. He didn't mean to. It just happened that way, the same way rain finds a seam in old wood. The back row had a draft and less light. A gray towel lay folded like a surrendered flag inside the last run. The dog on it was large, even curled tight, a black and tan shepherd built of angles and shadows, ribs mapping themselves beneath a coat gone dull with worry. What held Jack's boots to the concrete was not the collar scar at the throat or the tightness of a front paw, but the eyes. They were the color of singed amber. They did not plead. They watched. They took measure. He knew that look. He had seen it on a medic staring at a helicopter that never came on himself in the small square of a bathroom mirror at 3 a.m. when the house made a noise it had no business making. A volunteer approached a college kid with a ball cap and the quick, careful movements people use around things that hurt. "He came in 2 weeks ago," the kid said, voice respectful without pity. "Stray. No chip. Eats, but not when someone is looking. We keep things quiet for him." Jack nodded once. He didn't ask the dog's name. The card clipped to the kennel door said M and Underbreed GSD mix. Under notes, startles easily. Slow approach. He crouched anyway, not close, just enough to bring himself lower than those watchful eyes, and turned his shoulder a fraction. Not head on. He wouldn't want that either. The concrete pressed cold through the knees of his jeans. For a long minute, nothing happened. The dog's chest rose, fell. A truck downshifted on the road, and the shepherd's ears clicked forward, then flattened the body, tightening in a question that had too often been answered with pain. Jack breathed like a man learning again. "Hey," he said finally, the word shaped soft a note more than a sound. He felt foolish and a little unsteady, as if the floor had become a deck in heavy seas, and then the dog's gaze flicked to his mouth. The kid in the ball cap took a step back, sensing the thin thread strung between man and animal, and how it might snap. "We call him Hunter," the kid offered from the edge of the moment. "He doesn't come to it. He doesn't come to much." Hunter. It fit the lines of the dog even if the dog didn't know it yet. Jack said nothing. He let the name rest in the air the way you set a cup down for a guest who hasn't decided to stay. Somewhere near the front desk, a bell chimed. Someone laughed softly. The world went on with its small bravery. Jack kept his hands on his thighs, fingers open. No reaching, no insistence. The dog's nostrils trembled, scenting the human business of him. Coffee gone, cold hay from the feed store machine oil, the faint echo of wood smoke that clung to his jacket when the wind came out of the north. A draft moved a paper flyer on the wall, and its corner ticked like a second hand. "We've had a couple lookers," the kid said, faltering. "Families want puppies. Hunters like him. They take work. Work." Jack's mouth tilted in expression that would have been a smile if it had been practiced in recent years. "He takes time," he said as much to himself as to the volunteer. He knew what time could do and what it could not. He thought of the farm at the edge of Madison County, the house his father had painted white every other summer, the pasture rolling down to a creek where the cottonwoods kept their own counsel. He pictured the porch at dusk, the way the boards warmed a man's palms. If he lay his hands flat, the only sound a distant train, and the dog that was not yet his, breathing long and slow in sleep. He did not picture much beyond that. The shepherd shifted weight, tilting into a rise that stopped halfway. Jack saw it before it happened. The subtle gather of muscle, the quiver at the hinge of jaw, the decision made somewhere deep and not entirely chosen. The lunge came silent and clean, a line of motion from the back of the kennel to the front teeth flashing a warning bright as a flare. Jack did not flinch. He did not hold his ground like a test. He did a small, impossible thing. He lowered his gaze. He moved but inward, into the part of himself that had learned that force is sometimes a mirror and sometimes a knife. The chain link rattled. The volunteer swore under his breath and stepped forward. The dog stopped with his muzzle an inch from metal breath fogging the air between them. In that inch, the world decided not to break. Jack spoke again, not the word this time, but the tone that had once steadied young men on a night road. "Easy," he said, and somewhere in the bones of the shelter the sound of it laid down a plank bridging water. The dog's jaw quivered. He drew back by degrees, as if learning retreat in slow motion, and settled, not lying, not surrendering, but reclaiming the shape he'd folded himself into before a stranger bent the light around him. The kid's shoulders dropped. "Sorry, sir," he said. "He doesn't like men much. We think he stopped because guesses are clumsy around wounds." Jack stood slowly, the stiffness in his right knee writing its own history across his face. For a second, then gone. What does he like? The question seemed to surprise the volunteer. "He listens to the rain," the kid said after a moment. "When the roof rattles, he doesn't hide. He goes to the corner and just listens." Jack looked at the sprinkler stripes on the window beyond the kennels where a passing squall had laid water down in gentle bars. He imagined a storm crawling over the plains, the sky stitched by lightning, and a dog who took the sound into himself as if cataloging the world for later. He nodded. "Can I sit?" he asked. The kid hesitated, then fetched a folding stool. "Don't put your hand through," he cautioned. "Just be there." Jack sat. He did not speak again. He let the minutes do their work. People came and went. A little boy cried when a miniature terrier ignored him. A couple argued in whispers about whether weekends were enough for a husky. Somewhere down the hall a dryer clicked and hummed. Hunter shifted once, then again, and the second time his forepaw slid forward an inch toward the gate claws, rasping the concrete like a match that didn't catch. Jack breathed. The fluorescent hum steadied into the rhythm of a long-haul engine out on I-90. When at last Jack rose, his eyes had the steady look of a man who'd taken a measure and found against reason a weight he was willing to carry. At the front desk, the woman in the navy polo glanced at the clock and then at him, understanding the kind of decision that walks a person across a room. "You can think on it," she offered kindly. Jack signed the line next to a doctor, his handwriting careful as if neatness could keep something from slipping. "I'll need a minute," he said, voice calm. "I want to get a leash from my truck." He didn't say why. He didn't need to. When he turned back down the corridor, Hunter had lifted his head. The eyes that had looked through and past now looked at. They held their distance, their skepticism, their account of things lost. But something else had come to sit beside them, attention the first cousin of trust. Jack stopped 3 paces from the gate and waited, hands visible, posture patient. "All right," he said softly, the words shaped like a promise to both of them. "Let's see if we can walk out of here." The shelter lobby felt colder on Jack Carter's skin than the kennels had, as if the air itself had thinned with the weight of decisions people made here every day. The woman in the navy polo set a clipboard down on the counter and lowered her voice, her kind smile now tempered by resignation. "Mr. Carter, I want to be honest." She began with the practiced cadence of someone who had delivered the same warning too many times. "A dog like him is not easy. We've had inquiries, but no takers. He doesn't warm up, he doesn't play, he doesn't respond. In cases like this, we sometimes recommend humane euthanasia." Jack listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, his eyes fixed on the faint scuffs left by countless leashes dragged across the linoleum floor. She continued, "He's not adoptable by most standards. We call them unfit, damaged goods. I just don't want you to be surprised if he never comes around." He thought of the moment in the kennel, the half lunge that had stopped on its own, the way the dog's eyes had found his instead of the metal barrier, and he heard himself answer with a steady calm that brooked no persuasion. "He's not gone yet," Jack said, reaching for the pen. The paperwork was simple, frighteningly so. A signature and address, a line noting that he accepted all liability. He wrote each letter carefully, as if deliberate strokes could anchor the decision against doubt. When he handed the clipboard back, the woman gave him a long, searching look, then offered a leash looped from worn leather. "At least take this one," she said gently. "It's been his. He won't know yours." Jack accepted the leash and walked the corridor once more. Hunter rose halfway this time, ears pricked, body taut. When the latch clicked, the shepherd froze but did not retreat. Jack fastened the leash slowly, murmuring words that meant nothing and everything, then stood giving the dog the choice. Hunter hesitated, nostrils flaring, then stepped forward, not trustfully but not unwillingly either. Outside, the afternoon carried a bite of February. Jack guided Hunter toward the truck. Each step measured the shepherd's head, swiveling as if every shadow might conceal a trap. At the passenger side, Hunter balked, stiffening when Jack opened the door. Jack did not force him. He climbed into the driver's seat and waited, engine-off door ajar, his presence patient. 5 minutes passed, then 10. At last, the dog placed one paw on the running board, paused, then another, climbing into the cab with a reluctant grace curling not on the seat but pressed tight against the door muscles bunched as if ready to spring. When the engine rumbled to life, Hunter shifted restlessly, nails clicking on the mat breath, fast eyes darting at each passing shape through the window. Jack kept his hands steady on the wheel. The county road stretched ahead, fields muted in winter-gray fence posts, ticking past like a metronome. At mile 3, Hunter leaned harder into the door body, coiled as though a leap might deliver him from whatever fate the truck carried. Jack glanced sideways without turning his head, measuring the tension radiating from the dog. "You want out," he said softly, the words not scolding but acknowledging the way one soldier might name another's fear aloud to make it less alone. Hunter's ears twitched but his body stayed rigid. Jack continued his voice, a quiet current against the hum of tires. "Back there they called you unfit. I've heard that word too. But I've got land about 20 acres rolling down to a creek. A barn that leaks when it rains. Horses too old for work, but too proud to quit. It's quiet. No cages, no cold floors." The rhythm of his voice was steady, conversational, painting pictures of mornings when frost clung to fence rails and evenings when the sun lit the hayfield gold. "There's a porch where you can hear the train at night," he went on. "Cottonwoods that whisper if the wind leans right. I make coffee strong enough to wake the dead. You'd have space to breathe. No one yelling orders, just room." As the words drifted, something shifted beside him. Hunter's body eased a fraction, his head lowering just enough to break the taut line that had held since they left. He exhaled a sound half sigh, half concession, and settled his haunches still pressed to the door, but no longer poised for escape. Jack did not smile, not outwardly, but his chest filled with a breath that tasted less of iron. He kept talking, not because the dog understood the words, but because the cadence mattered the promise of continuity. He told of the creek that never froze solid, of the red-tailed hawk that nested on the western ridge of his grandfather's porch chair that creaked in the same place every time he sat. By the time they reached the county line, Hunter's eyes had softened from wild darting to cautious watching, tracking the movement of trees rather than the door handle. Jack risked a glance and found the dog looking at him, not long, not steady, but long enough to feel like an opening. The truck carried them forward, two figures bound by silence and the faint stirrings of recognition. Ahead, the road bent toward Madison County, and the house Jack had thought of as a refuge and a prison in equal measure. As the first snowflakes began to fall, he adjusted his grip on the wheel, steadying both their courses. Jack Carter's truck rumbled into the gravel drive of his grandfather's old ranch, just as the last traces of daylight bled into the horizon, and Hunter had pressed himself so tightly against the passenger door that Jack worried the shepherd might leap the second he slowed the engine. Yet, when the truck rolled to a stop, Hunter froze instead, his body stiff with suspicion, eyes tracking every shadow that stretched across the yard, and Jack understood that bringing him here was only the beginning. He left the engine running for a moment, speaking in that steady voice again, telling the dog that this was home, telling himself the same thing, though he had never quite believed it since returning from war. When he finally cut the ignition and stepped out, Hunter hesitated, then sprang from the cab in one motion, landing light on the gravel, before circling twice with the wary precision of a sentry scanning new ground. Jack led him toward the barn, the leash loose but ready, the February air crisp enough to sting the lungs, and he opened the wide sliding door to reveal a pen he had built that morning. Straw freshly laid a pail of water set neatly beside a bowl filled with feed, everything arranged with the kind of careful preparation a man might use to welcome a guest he feared would not stay. For a brief second, Jack thought it might work, that the order and quiet might calm the animal. But the moment Hunter crossed the threshold, his whole body buckled as if struck by an unseen blow, his hackles rising, eyes wide and frantic, and with a sudden twist he tore free of the leash and bolted past Jack into the night. The sound of his paws on frozen ground faded toward the pasture, then was lost beneath the rustle of wind through the cottonwoods. Jack stood in the barn doorway, the empty leash limp in his hand, his chest tight with both fear and recognition, for he knew the look of someone who could not bear confinement, and he could not fault Hunter for it. He shut the barn gently, no anger in the motion, only the slow acceptance of a man who had seen trust collapse before. He walked back to the porch of the farmhouse, its paint weathered, its boards creaking with the memory of his grandfather's steps, and he sat down on the top stair, resting his elbows on his knees, eyes searching the darkness. He could have gone inside, could have left the dog to whatever choice it would make, but he remembered the eyes that had once watched him through chain link, and he decided to keep watch in return. The night stretched long. The sky carried a pale wash of stars, the moon thin as a blade, and the sounds of the land came alive in ways a man noticed only when he stayed still, the distant hoot of an owl, the cry of coyotes hunting in the low country, the occasional crack of ice in the creek. Jack pulled his jacket tighter, his breath fogging, but he did not move. Hours passed. Once he thought he heard Hunter near the fence line, the faint crunch of paws and a low whine. But when Jack turned his head, he saw only shadows. He spoke into the night anyway, not calling, just talking, his voice weaving small stories about the farm, about the horses in the back pasture, about how mornings here began with coffee strong enough to keep a man upright. His words carried no command, only presence. Time thickened until it felt like another weight pressing on his shoulders. His back ached from the stare, his eyes burned from fatigue, yet he stayed. Near dawn, when the horizon began to pale and the fields grew shapes again instead of shadows, Jack saw him. Hunter lay in the frost-stiff grass 10 paces away, his body, low head resting on his paws, eyes open and fixed on the porch. He had not run away. He had not approached either. He had chosen the space between the distance where he could watch without surrender, guard without trust. Jack did not rise or beckon. He let the moment stand. The first light caught on Hunter's coat, turning the dull fur into something that glimmered faintly like tarnished bronze, and Jack felt something stir inside him, the small, fragile beginning of a bond built not on command, but on shared endurance. The rooster in the neighboring farm crowed. The first truck of the day hummed down the county road, and Jack remained on the porch, his eyes meeting Hunter's across the distance. They stayed like that, man and dog, 2 silhouettes joined by silence, until the sun lifted fully and the day declared itself. The morning after their long, silent vigil, Jack Carter moved through his routines with the steady rhythm of a man who understood that consistency could build trust where words could not. He filled water troughs for the 2 aging horses that still grazed the back pasture, carried hay bales from the barn, and left Hunter to watch from his chosen distance beneath the cottonwoods. The dog had not entered the barn since the first night, and Jack did not press him. Instead, he worked within sight, giving space but always allowing the shepherd to mark his presence. The February sun rose thin and pale, offering little warmth but enough clarity to show Hunter's eyes tracking each step. By noon, Jack returned to the porch, his boots creaking on the boards, and for the first time since arriving, Hunter followed halfway across the yard before settling to the ground, ears pricked but body tense. Jack let the nearness be its own progress. The hours unfolded in small increments of patience until late afternoon, when a sudden gust of wind slammed the farmhouse's screen door shut with a crack sharp enough to slice the stillness. The sound was ordinary, something Jack had heard 1,000 times, but to Hunter it was thunder and mortars and chaos returned. The shepherd sprang to his feet, eyes wide, pupils blown with panic, and in a desperate frenzy he bolted toward the perimeter fence. His body struck the wire with brutal force once. Then again, claws scraping teeth, gnashing the harsh clatter of metal, mixing with his ragged growls. Blood streaked his muzzle where he bit against the barrier, his shoulder scraped raw from the wire, and Jack's heart clenched at the sight. He knew this kind of terror. He had lived it in barracks when a car backfired down the street and sent him clawing for cover. Instinct told him to grab, to restrain, to pull the animal away, but experience whispered something deeper force would only tighten the snare already choking Hunter. So Jack did the unthinkable for a man trained to control chaos. He sank to the cold ground a few yards from the fence, his back against the earth legs, bent palms open. He did not advance. He did not shout. Instead, he let his body language fold small, a posture of surrender, and then he spoke not to command, but to confess. "I know that sound," he said, his voice low and steady, threading through the din of Hunter's panic. "I know how it pulls you back." He described the nights when dreams dragged him to deserts half a world away, where the air was thick with smoke and cries, and nothing he did could bring his men home. He spoke of the times he woke in darkness, sweat chilling his spine, certain he still heard the thump of helicopters that never landed. His words came halting at first, but once loosed, they carried their own truth. A rhythm Hunter could not interpret with language, but could feel in cadence, tone, and breath. Hunter's frenzy slowed his body, still heaving with exertion, blood staining the fence, yet his ears twitched toward Jack's voice. Jack kept talking, painting the landscape of his memory, not with detail of violence, but with the honesty of fear. "It stays with you," he murmured. "Every sound becomes a warning. Every silence feels like a trap. You run, even when there's nowhere to run. Hunter pressed once more against the fence, a last desperate shove, then sagged back onto the frozen ground, chest heaving, flanks trembling. His eyes wild moments before shifted to Jack, and something in the timbre of the man's voice held him. Jack leaned forward slightly, careful not to break the fragile distance. "You're not alone out here," he said softly. "It's just us. I'll keep watch if you need to rest." The evening light dipped, staining the sky amber, and Hunter lowered his head by degrees until his chin brushed the ground. His breathing slowed, still rough but steadying. Jack did not move closer, though his heart ached to check the bleeding. He knew touch too soon would fracture what had barely begun. Instead, he stayed seated in the dirt-knees stiff jacket, gathering frost, telling stories of small things, how his grandfather built the porch rail by hand, how the creek once overflowed and carried half the garden away, how every spring a pair of robins nested in the same tree near the fence. The words filled the cold air, not explanations, but offerings, a reminder that the world contained more than the echoes of war. By the time darkness fell, Hunter's body had stilled. His eyes half-lidded, but still fixed on Jack, not with trust, but with recognition of something shared. Jack rose only when the first stars appeared, moving slowly toward the house, leaving the door ajar, a gesture of invitation rather than expectation. He glanced back once and saw Hunter lying still near the fence, eyes watching, body quiet. Jack stepped inside, knowing the fragile truce of this night was only the beginning, yet it was a beginning nonetheless. The morning after Hunter's panic at the fence, Jack Carter knew he had to take the next step. The dog's outburst had left blood on the wire and raw scrapes along his shoulder, and though Hunter had quieted, Jack could see the pain in every guarded movement. He made an appointment with Dr. Emily Brooks, the town veterinarian who had cared for his family's horses for years and had once stitched up his grandfather's sheepdog after a barbed wire accident. Emily was steady and soft-spoken, someone who understood that silence often carried more weight than words. When Jack called, she agreed to come out rather than force Hunter into the small, sterile space of her clinic. The day was bright, the sky high and sharp, the kind of morning when every sound carried across the frozen ground. Jack led Hunter into the open yard, giving him space to circle and settle. When Emily arrived, she greeted Jack quietly, then crouched a respectful distance from Hunter, letting him take in her scent. At first, Hunter only stood rigid, ears twitching, tail stiff, his gaze never leaving the bag she carried. Emily murmured softly, her hands calm as she opened the bag and withdrew a stethoscope. The metallic glint caught Hunter's eye, and in an instant, the calm shattered. The shepherd lunged sideways, his body twisting with feral speed, and the leash strained taut in Jack's grip. Hunter snapped his jaws so close to the rope that fibers frayed his growl, deep and raw, his eyes wild with the kind of fear that could not be reasoned away. Jack braced, holding the leash steady, not yanking, just anchoring, while Emily froze where she was not daring to advance. The shepherd's body thrashed, his paws scraping furrows into the earth, his teeth working dangerously close to freedom. For a long, terrible moment, Jack thought the rope would give, and then Hunter stilled, panting heavily, body trembling, as if each muscle fought itself. Jack dropped to a knee, murmuring the same low cadence he had used in the barn, telling Hunter it was all right, that there would be no cages, no hands forcing him down. Gradually, the shepherd's weight sagged his chest, heaving, the growl dying to a ragged whimper. Emily met Jack's eyes, regret heavy. "I can't touch him like this," she admitted. "Not without breaking the trust you've built. Something in his past makes these tools unbearable." Jack nodded, his heart heavy, and told her they would try again another time. She left behind ointment and instructions for surface wounds, but the deeper pain would remain hidden. That evening, after Emily had gone and the sun had lowered beyond the cottonwoods, Jack sat on the porch with Hunter lying a cautious distance away. The dog licked at his shoulder, his movements stiff, and Jack's gaze lingered on the way. Hunter winced when he shifted his weight. Something more than scrapes troubled him. Jack waited until twilight thickened, then walked slowly across the yard, lowering himself to the ground near the shepherd. Hunter tensed, but did not bolt. Jack spoke softly, his voice carrying the patience of a man who knew how to endure long silences. He let the minutes pass until Hunter's breathing steadied, then reached his hand out, not to grab, but to hover near the dog's neck. Hunter's ears flicked his body rigid, but he did not strike. Jack's fingers brushed the fur, lightly moving with the caution of someone diffusing a delicate wire. That was when he felt it, a hard ridge beneath the skin, just behind the shoulder blade, sharp against his touch. Not bone, not scar tissue. He froze, then pressed gently around the spot. Hunter flinched violently, twisting away with a pained yelp, then wheeled back, eyes wild but not snapping, as if torn between defense and desperation. Jack sat back immediately, his hand open, voice calm. Easy, Hunter. Easy. I won't push. But the knowledge settled heavy in him. That was not an ordinary wound. It felt like shrapnel, the kind of fragment a medic might miss in the chaos of battle, the kind of injury that could fester unseen for years. Jack had seen soldiers return with metal lodged in muscle, their bodies carrying reminders of explosions long past. Now, looking at Hunter, he realized this dog had been through more than neglect or abandonment. He had been to war just as Jack had. The revelation filled Jack with both sorrow and a grim sense of kinship. Hunter's every twitch, every bolt of panic, every guarded glance. It was not random. It was the body remembering pain that had never been healed. Jack leaned back on his hands, eyes searching the horizon where the sky faded to violet. They left you with it, he murmured. They patched what they could and let the rest lie. No wonder you can't rest. Hunter lowered himself cautiously to the ground, his head on his paws, watching Jack with eyes that seemed older than any animal's should. Jack stayed beside him until the stars emerged, his mind already moving toward what came next. He could not remove the fragment himself. He would need Emily, but he would also need time, trust, and a way to show Hunter that not every hand brought pain. As the night deepened, Hunter shifted closer, closing the distance by a single careful step, and Jack took it as a fragile promise. 2 days after Jack Carter had discovered the shard of metal lodged beneath Hunter's skin, he drove into town for Feed the Shepherd, riding in the back of the truck bed, tethered but upright ears, scanning the passing fields, as though every fence line held meaning. Jack parked outside Wilson's Feed and Supply, a squat brick building that had stood since before his grandfather's time. Inside, the bell over the door chimed, and the scent of grain and leather filled the air. Old Tom Reed, a Korean War veteran who had run the store since retiring from the mill, leaned against the counter with the weight of a man who carried both years and stories. Tom greeted Jack with the kind of nod reserved for fellow servicemen, and when his eyes drifted past Jack's shoulder to the dog waiting at the open truck bed, his expression changed. He set down the ledger, came around the counter, and stepped outside, his gaze fixed on Hunter as though seeing a ghost. The shepherd stiffened, head-lowering body angled for flight, but Tom stopped a respectful distance away. "That dog," Tom said quietly, his voice thinning with disbelief. "He's not just a stray." Jack tensed his instincts on guard. "What do you mean?" Tom gestured with a trembling hand. The way he holds himself even hurt. Look at the scars along his flank, the cropped ear, the way his eyes don't scan like a farm dog's. They sweep like a soldier on patrol. I've seen canines back when my boy served in Iraq. That's a military dog. Jack turned slowly, studying Hunter with fresh eyes. The details he had noticed but not named now gathered into a pattern, the stance too precise, the awareness too sharp, the scars too purposeful. "You're sure Jack asked?" Tom nodded grimly. I'd stake what's left of my pension. That dog's been deployed." The words settled heavy between them, stirring something old in Jack's chest. Later that evening, after Hunter had settled in his usual post near the cottonwoods, Tom drove out to the Carter Ranch carrying a weathered folder. He had gone home after their conversation and rummaged through his son's old Foot Locker's letters and service bulletins. "I couldn't shake it," Tom admitted as he laid the folder on Jack's kitchen table. "So I called an old buddy at the VFW, someone who still has contacts. He owed me a favor." He pulled a name. Jack opened the folder, his eyes scanning faded documents stamped with redactions. What remained legible was enough. The file described a military working dog, German Shepherd call sign Hunter, attached to the 302nd Infantry out of Kandahar Province. The notes were sparse, but one report caught Jack's breath. Unit ambushed on supply route. Handler KIA. Canine sustained injuries during contact. Recovered medevac with casualties. Record sealed following incident. Jack's hands tightened on the paper, the words pulling him backward into his own memories of sudden fire and the confusion of smoke, the way silence after an attack carried the weight of absence more than sound ever could. "They lost most of that patrol," Tom said quietly. "My buddy said it was ugly. The survivors scattered. The dog made it back, but once the handler was gone, no one claimed him. Files got buried." Jack looked toward the yard where Hunter now dozed lightly, his ears still twitching at distant noises. The puzzle pieces clicked into place, the fear of medical instruments, the embedded shrapnel, the reflexive patrol stance. He was not a stray. He was a soldier wounded and discarded into silence. "Why bury it?" Jack asked, his voice hard. Tom shook his head. "Sometimes when losses mount, the reports get sealed. Maybe they didn't want questions about the ambush, or maybe no one wanted the responsibility of a traumatized war dog. Easier to write him off than to heal him." Jack closed the folder with a finality that echoed in the quiet kitchen. He felt the stirrings of anger and sorrow braided together. "He deserved better," Jack said. Tom's weathered face softened. "So did a lot of us, son. But maybe he found the right place now." Jack carried the folder to the porch, later reading the lines aloud in a low voice, letting Hunter hear his own story spoken back to him. The dog raised his head, eyes glinting in the dusk, ears flicking as though something familiar echoed in Jack's tone. Jack crouched near, careful of distance, and murmured, "You were left out there, weren't you? You fought, you bled, and they forgot." Hunter's gaze held his steady, a soldier's look across a silent field. Jack felt the bond deepen into something undeniable, not just rescuer and rescued, but comrades, both scarred by war, both carrying wounds that refused to vanish. The night air grew colder, stars pricking the sky, and Jack knew the discovery of Hunter's past would change everything. Tomorrow he would begin searching for more, because the story of a dog abandoned by silence deserved to be told, and perhaps in telling it both man and animal could begin to heal. The storm arrived unannounced, as they often did in Montana, sweeping across the wide plains with a wall of black sky and a wind that bent the cottonwoods like supplicants. Jack Carter was closing the barn doors when the first flash of lightning carved the horizon, followed seconds later by thunder so sharp it rattled the corrugated roof. He glanced toward the yard and saw Hunter's stiffened body, low tail, pressed tight, the shepherd's breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. Jack braced for the inevitable. The desperate bolt, the blind frenzy that had marked their earlier nights. But what happened instead caught him off guard. Hunter trembled, every muscle taut, his eyes darting as the storm rolled overhead, yet rather than fleeing toward the fence, he staggered toward Jack. When another thunderclap split the air, the shepherd pressed his flank against Jack's leg, leaning hard enough to shift his balance. Jack froze, heart tightening at the feel of that weight, and then he slowly lowered his hand to rest lightly on Hunter's shoulder, not restraining, just steadying. The dog quivered but did not pull away. Together they stood in the open barn doorway as rain sheeted across the fields, the world lit by erratic flashes. Jack spoke softly, almost to himself. "It's just thunder, Hunter. Just the sky talking loud." His voice was calm, but his chest carried its own storm, for he knew exactly what Hunter saw in that sound. Not clouds, but explosions. Not rain, but dust and smoke. He knew because he saw them too. The storm raged for over an hour, and through every crack of thunder, Hunter remained at his side, shivering, but holding his ground. When at last the lightning drifted east and the rain settled into a steady patter, Jack knelt in the straw, his eyes level with Hunter's. The shepherd's gaze was raw pupils wide, but there was no wild panic now, only endurance. Jack brushed his hand once more along Hunter's shoulder, careful of the old wound, and whispered, "You did good, soldier." It was not praise for obedience, but recognition of survival, the kind of words Jack had once spoken to young men who simply made it through another day. That night, fatigue weighed heavy. Jack returned to the farmhouse, leaving the door ajar as he had begun to do an unspoken invitation. He climbed the narrow staircase, the wood groaning familiar complaints, and lay down on the bed that had long felt too large for one. Sleep came quickly, but not kindly. In dreams, he was back on the patrol route, sand stinging his eyes, the radio crackling with urgency, the sudden eruption of fire in the distance. He heard men calling, saw shadows collapse, felt the helplessness that time had never dulled. His body jerked, breath ragged, until the thunder of memory dragged him upright, sweat chilling his back. The room was dark. The storm outside reduced to a gentle rain. But he was not alone. At the edge of the bed, Hunter lay stretched on the rug, head raised, eyes wide and unblinking. The dog had not been sleeping. He had been watching, as if guarding against something neither of them could see. Jack wiped his face with a hand that trembled more than he liked, then met those amber eyes. For a moment, the silence between them felt like a recognition older than words. Hunter's gaze was not soft but steady, as though he understood what it meant to wake with ghosts. Jack lowered himself back onto the mattress, but he left his arm hanging over the side. After a long pause, Hunter shifted closer, his body moving inch by inch until his shoulder brushed the bed frame. He did not seek touch, but he allowed presence, and that was enough. Jack closed his eyes again, his breath slowly evening out, comforted by the quiet sentinel beside him. Dawn found them both weary but grounded in a fragile new rhythm. Two soldiers, one man, and one dog who had chosen to stand near each other when the storm came. It was a Sunday afternoon when the knock came, a hesitant sound against the weathered wood of Jack Carter's farmhouse door. He opened it to find a woman standing with a folded letter clutched in her hands. She was in her 40s, her dark hair pulled back, her expression carrying both strength and sorrow that time had not erased. "Mr. Carter?" she asked softly. "My name is Sarah Miller." Jack nodded, stepping aside, sensing this visit was more than neighborly courtesy. Sarah's gaze moved past him to the yard where Hunter lay stretched near the porch steps, alert even in rest. Her breath caught audibly, her hand tightening on the letter. "That dog," she whispered. "I think I know him." Jack motioned her inside, and over coffee she unfolded the letter, her fingers lingering on the creases, as though they still held the warmth of the man who had written it. "My husband, Captain David Miller, wrote this before his unit was hit outside Kandahar." She explained, her voice steady, though her eyes shimmered. She began to read aloud, and Jack listened as the words painted a picture he already half knew. The letter spoke of long patrols of men exhausted, but kept steady by the presence of a watchful shepherd they called Guardian. It described how on the night before the ambush the dog had refused to settle pacing ears, straining, issuing low growls that pulled the soldiers from their fatigue. "He saved us," the letter read, "because when Guardian wouldn't rest, we didn't either. We tightened our perimeter, and when the first shots came, we weren't asleep. Half of us made it out. Without him, none of us would. Sarah's voice broke slightly as she lowered the letter. My husband died later in that same fight, she said. But he wanted me to know that a dog had stood between his men and death. When I saw yours today, I knew. Jack glanced toward Hunter, whose eyes met his from the porch with that same soldier's steadiness. His records were sealed, Jack admitted. But this proves what he was. Not just a stray, not just broken. He was part of your husband's story. Sarah nodded, her tears falling silently. I wanted you to know, she said, and I wanted him to know he's remembered. In the days that followed, word spread through town. Sarah spoke quietly to neighbors, and the story wove itself from porch to porch, store to store, until everyone in Madison County seemed to know about the shepherd who had once saved American soldiers overseas. The response was quiet at first, a bag of premium dog food left by the gate, a fleece blanket folded neatly on the fence post, a small flag tucked into the mailbox. Then it grew. Jack returned from the fields one afternoon to find a circle of candles burning at the end of his drive, each one placed by townsfolk who remembered what it meant to honor service. Veterans began to stop by, men with canes and women with folded uniforms, each pausing at the gate to salute the shepherd, who now stood sentinel on Montana soil. One afternoon, Sheriff Daniel Hayes parked his cruiser at the edge of the drive and walked up the path, his hat in hand. Carter, he said, we hear stories every day, but this one matters. That dog is part of the town now. Folks want to protect him as much as he's protected others. Jack looked at Hunter, who stood calmly by the porch, ears pricked at the sheriff's words. It felt strange, this shift from isolation to community, but he understood the power of stories carried by many voices. The shepherd was no longer invisible. He was honored. As spring inched closer, the gestures multiplied. Children left hand-drawn cards with crayon sketches of a dog with a medal around his neck. Veterans placed coins at the fence, a silent tribute known among soldiers. Even the pastor from the local church stopped by to offer a prayer of thanks at the gate. Jack watched all this with quiet awe, the weight of his solitude easing in ways he had not expected. Hunter seemed to sense it too. Though he still kept his distance from most, he no longer bolted when strangers approached. He watched measured, and then stood tall as though remembering the role he had once carried. One evening, as Jack sat on the porch watching the last of the sunset, Sarah returned with her son, a boy of 12, clutching a photograph of his father in uniform. Hunter approached slowly, his steps deliberate until he stood before the boy. The child extended the picture with trembling hands, and to Jack's surprise, Hunter lowered his head, sniffing gently, before sitting with the solemn dignity of a soldier at attention. The boy whispered, "Thank you," and Hunter remained motionless, as if accepting both the tribute and the grief. That night, Jack understood the truth. Hunter was no longer just his to protect. The town had claimed him as one of their own, a veteran returned not in parades or medals, but in scars and loyalty. The weight of responsibility grew heavier, but so did the strength to bear it. The bond between man and dog was no longer private. It was now part of something larger, a community willing to remember and to stand beside them. The spring air carried a deceptive calm when the black SUV rolled up the Carter Ranch driveway. Jack was in the yard splitting wood when two men stepped out, their boots too polished, their jackets too new, their eyes scanning the property with a precision that reminded him of briefings overseas. One of them smiled thinly, extending a business card. "Mr. Carter," he said, "we represent a private security firm operating internationally. We've heard about your dog." Jack's hand froze on the axe handle, his eyes narrowing. "He's not for sale." The man chuckled as if humoring a stubborn farmer. "You misunderstand. A dog like that combat-trained field experienced, he has value, significant value. We're prepared to compensate you generously." Behind them, Hunter had risen from his post near the porch, his body, rigid ears forward, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Jack saw the men's gaze flick toward the shepherd, the way they appraised him like equipment instead of a living being. His voice came out even, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. "He's not property. He's a veteran. You need to leave." The second man stepped forward, his expression harder. "Think carefully, Carter. Dogs like him aren't meant for retirement. He's wasted out here. He belongs in the field, and we're offering you a way out before the government decides he's a liability." Jack took one step closer, his shadow falling across the gravel. "You've had your say. Now you're trespassing." The silence stretched, broken only by Hunter's growl. Finally, the first man raised his hands in mock surrender. "As you wish. But opportunities like this don't come twice." They climbed back into the SUV, the engine kicking gravel as they pulled away, but Jack knew men like that didn't simply vanish. He watched the road long after the taillights disappeared, his gut tightening with an old familiar sense of unfinished business. That night, the ranch lay under a moonless sky, the quiet punctuated only by the occasional rustle of wind through budding trees. Jack locked the doors but could not shake the unease. He sat at the kitchen table cleaning his grandfather's old revolver, a relic more ceremonial than practical, while Hunter paced restlessly near the back door. Around midnight, the dog froze, head snapping toward the fence line. His growl was low, primal, and steady. Jack rose, his pulse quickening, and slipped the revolver into his belt. Together they moved to the porch, the boards cool beneath bare feet. At first the darkness revealed nothing. Then Jack saw it, the faint shimmer of metal where the moonlight caught the cut wire of the perimeter fence. Someone had been here. Someone might still be. Jack's breath slowed, his senses sharpening, but before he could step forward, Hunter advanced. The shepherd placed himself squarely at the porch steps, body rigid, hackles raised, teeth bared in a silent snarl at the unseen intruders beyond the fence. Jack whispered, "Easy, Hunter," but the dog did not back away. His gaze locked on the shadows as if daring them closer. For a moment Jack thought the shepherd might bolt as he once had, choosing escape over confrontation. Instead, Hunter planted himself more firmly, the growl deepening into a warning that carried through the night air. Jack scanned the yard, catching the faintest shift of movement near the tree-lined figures retreating, the crunch of boots muffled by grass. Whoever had come did not linger once faced with resistance. The silence returned heavy but intact. Jack knelt beside Hunter, laying a steady hand on his flank. The dog's muscles quivered with the energy of the encounter, but he did not break position until the last sound faded into the distance. Only then did he ease down his chest, rising and falling with measured breaths, eyes still fixed outward. Jack exhaled, pride and relief threading through his fatigue. "You stayed," he murmured. "You didn't run. You chose to stand." Hunter's ears flicked, and though the night offered no answer, Jack felt the bond between them tighten into something unspoken and unbreakable. The shepherd was no longer just surviving. He was choosing. He had placed himself not as a fugitive, but as a guardian. Long after Hunter had settled at the porch edge, Jack remained beside him, both man and dog staring into the darkness beyond the cut fence. They knew the threat was not gone. It had only stepped back into the shadows. And yet for the first time, Jack felt certain they would face it together. The letter arrived in a government envelope, its official seal pressed crisp against the paper. Jack Carter stood on the porch with Hunter at his side, the sound of the mail truck fading down the county road, and he held the envelope for a long while before breaking it open. Inside was a formal document bearing the insignia of the Department of Defense. The words struck him with a weight that made his knees bend slightly, and he sat down on the porch rail to read them again. Hunter, formerly designated as Military Working Dog MWD 473, is hereby recognized as a United States veteran. Records sealed due to classified operations have been reopened, confirming his service in Kandahar Province. Commendations will be entered posthumously for his unit, with Hunter receiving full honors as a veteran of war. Jack lowered the paper slowly, his throat tightening. Hunter sat upright beside him, ears twitching as though sensing the gravity in Jack's silence. "They see you now," Jack whispered. "Not a tool, not forgotten. A soldier." Days later, Agent Mark Wilson arrived at the ranch. He was direct his presence, carrying the air of unfinished business. Over coffee at Jack's kitchen table, he explained the investigation underway. "The men who came here, the ones who cut your fence, they're connected to a contractor who's been trying to reclaim military dogs off the books. Hunter isn't the first they targeted, but he may be the last. With the evidence you and Mrs. Miller provided, we're moving to shut them down." Jack listened quietly, his hand resting on the table, his knuckles tight. Wilson continued. "This has sparked something larger. The Pentagon is reopening all files on military canines discharged without proper retirement. We're establishing oversight to ensure they receive medical care, proper placement, and recognition. Hunter's case has become the catalyst." Jack glanced toward the window where Hunter lay watching the yard. "He's earned every bit of it," Jack said. Wilson nodded. "So have you. You gave him a place when no one else would. That matters." When Wilson departed, Jack stood in the doorway long after the government sedan had disappeared down the road. For the first time in years, he felt a faint measure of justice stir justice not only for Hunter, but for every soldier man or dog left behind by silence. In the weeks that followed, small but steady changes rippled outward. The local newspaper ran an article on four-legged veterans and donations poured in for veterinary programs. Letters arrived addressed to Hunter, many from families of handlers who had served with dogs like him. Some included photographs of German Shepherds and Belgian Malinois in dusty uniforms, their eyes sharp, their loyalty evident even through faded film. Jack pinned the letters to a corkboard in the hallway, a growing tribute that turned the old farmhouse into something like a memorial. Through it all, Hunter adapted in his own quiet way. He still woke at sudden noises, still scanned the tree line each evening, but the wild edge of his fear had softened. He chose to linger near Jack more often, his body relaxing into moments of trust. One evening, as the last of the daylight faded, Jack stood at the open doorway of the farmhouse. He did not speak, did not beckon. He simply opened the door wide and waited. Hunter stood at the bottom step, his silhouette sharp against the fading light. His ears flicked, his body tense, the decision written in the stillness. Then, with a slow and deliberate step, he climbed the stairs. His paws touched the porch boards, then the threshold, and he crossed inside. Jack did not move, only watched as Hunter padded across the wooden floor to the fireplace. The dog circled once, then lowered himself onto the rug, his head lifting toward the fire's glow. After a long moment, Hunter rose again and walked to Jack's chair. He rested his head across Jack's knee, the weight steady and warm. Jack laid his hand gently on the shepherd's back, his voice low. "We're home now, both of us." The fire cracked. Shadows danced across the old walls, and in the silence, Jack felt the bond seal itself in ways words could never capture. Two warriors, one man, one dog, had carried scars too deep for ceremony, but here, in this quiet house, they had found their ground. It was not the medals or the recognition that defined them. It was this, the choice to stay, the choice to guard, the choice to trust again. Outside, the land stretched wide and still under a night sky, and for the first time in a long time, Jack Carter felt the kind of peace he once thought unreachable. Hunter shifted closer, his breathing slow and steady, his body at rest. Together they sat, bound by silence, by memory, and by a shared vow: no more running, no more forgetting. Home had been found, and it would hold. Thank you for staying with us through this story. What do you think about the bond between a soldier and a dog who both carried the weight of war? Which moment touched you the most? Share your thoughts below and let us know the city or country where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your voice. If you found meaning in this story, please give it a like and subscribe so you won't miss the next one.